Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mr. McGee here at Parkway West Career Technical Center. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the two-cycle engine, about the components, about the operation, and the different types of valves. So essentially, what we're going to be doing is in the CIP 4700.699, we're going to be going over tasks 1005, which is to identify the components, parts in a short block of a two-cycle engine and explain their purposes. We're also going to be going over 1007, which is to explain the two-cycle engine operating theory in this video. And also we're going to be going over 1010, which is to discuss the types of two-stroke engine valves that are out there. So on my workstation here, I have excuse me, simple components of a lawn boy engine. Previous videos we've talked about four-cycle engines and all the many parts that are associated with it. If you have your crankshaft, you have your camshaft, you have your valves, you have your lifters, you have your rocker arms, you have your push rods, you have your engine block, you have your seal, etc., all your seals. There's a lot of components. Two-cycle engine is built a lot simpler. Excuse me here. Let's start out just looking at a few key components of a two-cycle engine. As I said before, there are many parts in a four-cycle engine. Two-cycle, you're dealing with your engine block or cylinder, which in this case happens to be two parts. And the reason that it's two parts is for the purpose of disassembly. I'll show you in a couple minutes how this all goes together and how this all functions. But you have the back of your crankcase and you have the front of your crankcase, which also incorporates your cylinder. And within the cylinder, if I can get this close enough and on the right angle, you can see the ports that are within here. You see my finger sticking right through this one, for example. That would be our exhaust port. Then on the side is an intake or a transfer port, which brings the fuel from the crankcase up. You have a transfer port there, and you have a transfer port over on this side of the cylinder as well. So you have your engine crankcase and block. You have your crankshaft with roller bearings or with ball bearings on either side. You have your piston, two rings, and a connecting rod. That's really all there is. Those are your key components. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I forgot. Let's not forget the head, which is going to go on the top of the cylinder, and that's where our combustion chamber is and where all the combustion process takes place. Other odd and end parts for our engine, we have our carburetor and air filter, relatively simple design. We have our ignition coil, and we have our flywheel. So let's talk a little bit about the two-cycle engine. Our key components are, as stated, crankcase halves, crankshaft, rod and piston, cylinder head. Those are where, the piston and rod and crankshaft are our moving parts. So the way a two-cycle engine works, you have to understand there are multiple sequences going on at the same time. Okay? For example, our carburetor mounts at the bottom of the crankcase right here. Our carburetor sits right up in here, and our air and fuel is taken from our carburetor into the back of the engine through these reed valves. Okay, as the air and fuel is sucked into the engine due to low pressure, these reed valves will open up and allow the fuel and air to come in, and then when there's pressure inside the crankcase, they close shut and they stop the fuel and air from going back out. So they're like a one-way check valve. Okay, so our carburetor sits on the back of the engine. Then we have our reed valve. When this engine is turning, Okay, we'll put our crankshaft down inside of the block, and as you can see, it rotates very fast. As our crankshaft is rotating, when our piston comes down into the crankcase area, like so, when it comes down, it actually creates a pressure within the crankcase area, which is also associated with this area right in here. This is all where our pressure is built up. While that's happening, our piston is up inside of the cylinder and it's blocking off these transfer ports, which will allow, if the piston comes down far enough in the cylinder, it will allow these transfer ports to uncover, and our pressure from the crankcase will come right up alongside of here and exit this port, this transfer port, right up into the, what they call the secondary area of the two-cycle engine. The lower portion where the crankcase is known as the primary area. The reason it's called the primary area is because that is the first place that the fuel and air comes into. The first place that the fuel and air comes into is right down here in the crankcase, or the primary area. Our piston is going to play a key role. As the piston comes down and pressurizes this area, the fuel and air which is in there, the piston comes down far enough and uncovers the transfer port, and that allows the fuel and air under pressure to go up into the top of the, above the piston, which is called our secondary area, okay? So if you give me a minute here, I'll put this piston in here and we can show you how things work.